New York City has a really weird public school system. I didn't grow up here and I don't have kids, so it doesn't really affect me. But it is very strange to observe as kind of an outsider because this is not how it works in most American cities. New York City has regular public schools that, any local resident can go to, but there are also these specialized high schools like Stuyvesant High School, Bronx Science. These are for high achieving students. This is how you get your AOCs and your Zoran Mamdanis. These are schools that you have to test into. So every year, these schools put on an SHSAT, which any student can take. And if you do really well, you get into the good high school, and then you end up on a track towards success. What's funny about this, though, is that every year they do this and they let in a new class of students. But because everything is purely based on tests and everything is blindly graded, what you end up with is high schools that are majority Asian, which is very funny because it always plays out this way. And there's always this big debate kind of in the city about whether this is the right way to do things, whether this is fair and inclusive. And unlike typical debates about this kind of thing, this isn't really a matter of resources. This isn't like, rich kids who are getting advantaged because if you're rich in New York City, you don't go to public school, you go to private school. So all of these Asian kids who are acing this test and going to the best high school, these are mostly, working class students, people who just really, really studied and crammed for this test and did well. And then they end up going to the good school. In American culture more broadly, there are stereotypes about Asian students being very high achieving. And I think in recent years, you've seen a lot of explanations that focus on the family. And there was a book a little while ago about, tiger moms or whatever, about Asian parents who like bully their kids into studying and everything is very brutal and disciplined. And I think there is some merit to this, but I think to really understand what's happening when you see a New York City high school that is half Asian, to really understand what's happening, you have to understand Asian culture more broadly from a historical perspective and to understand what it actually means to do well in school in Asian culture. Now, I'm saying Asian, and I'm mostly going to talk about China, but this applies pretty broadly in East Asia because underlying Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese culture is Confucianism. That is the underlying operating system of East Asian culture. And it's been like this for over 1,000 years. This is going back to the ancient times. Confucianism is what drives Asian culture and is, despite the political differences that you see between different countries now, it's all Confucianism when you go down. It's turtles all the way down, as they say. Now, to understand the importance of Confucianism in Chinese culture, ancient Chinese culture, and the reason I'm talking about China is that it's got the most history and there's, it goes back the furthest. And politically, it's kind of the easiest to wrap your head around if you just think about China as a culture, because China has been around for over 2,000 years and they're very proud of that fact. And they've kept pretty good records of what was happening going all the way back. Now, in ancient China, and I would say ancient, I mean pre-1905 China, the only path to success for a commoner, for a regular person, was to take the imperial exam. That was how the entire Chinese civilization was organized was around taking this exam and doing well on it, well enough to, you know, jump to the highest level of social standing. Now, the Chinese imperial exam system was basically, it's kind of the equivalent to the civil service exam that we take in America, except it was for everything in the government and ultimately in society. It was about taking this test. So, because of that, and because there was so much emphasis on this specific test, your entire family would basically pick one kid out of the family, usually the oldest boy, and tell him, you gotta ace this test. The entire family, the entire village is basically dedicating itself to making sure you succeed in this one specific thing, which is a lot of pressure to put on a 7-year-old. But that's the only system we have, so that's what we're going to do. Now, you got to understand what this test was, because it wasn't a test in the way that we think about school tests now. It wasn't really like the SATs, because, like I said, what we're testing on is Confucianism. And you got to understand about Confucianism, this isn't a religion. Like I said, it's the operating system. The fundamental principle of Confucianism, the whole point of it, is social cohesion and harmony. On an individual level, this really means subservience. It means obedience. It means embracing the system and not questioning it. Which is why the imperial exams, they tested you on what's basically, it's called like the Confucian classics. It's the 4 books and the 5 classics, or whatever it was called, which basically detail how individuals are supposed to act in society and how society is supposed to be organized. And the thing that it was really testing was not your critical thinking skills, not your ability to understand, but how badly you want to submit to the system, which was why the Chinese imperial exams were basically a test of rote memorization. Here are these 9 books or whatever. You have to memorize each of them word by word. And we're going to test you on how well you can just regurgitate everything. That is how we're going to test how dedicated you are to the system. Mind you, this went on for thousands of years, so everybody had always done this for as long as anybody could remember. And the thing you got to understand about Confucian texts, and you can kind of look this up if you look it up on like Google Images or whatever, is that these were written not to be understood as much as they were written to be memorized. Because, I mean, you got to think about China as being it's always been a big country. It's always had a bunch of different dialects, different regions. But the Confucian texts, they weren't written in Mandarin. They weren't written in Cantonese. They were written in classic Chinese, a kind of Chinese that nobody actually spoke. It would be the equivalent of, Shakespearean ye olde English. So you're giving a little kid these textbooks and telling him, hey, you have to memorize all of these. They're written in a language that you don't really understand, and they're written without punctuation. They're written in a very dense, opaque way. It would be like a 7-year-old American kid being given Plato, the Republic, and being told to memorize them. And, oh, by the way, this book it's the original Greek, so you just have to memorize it word by word. sound by sound. So you end up with a whole generation of kids who are memorizing something that they don't even understand it. They just know the sounds, and they know that they have to be able to recite all of it. The imperial exams, they weren't just about getting the right answers. They graded you on handwriting. It was also a calligraphy test. And it wasn't just rote memorization, there was an essay section as well. Whereas, but it's not like the essay section in, the SAT, like an American exam, where they're testing you on critical thinking and, reading comprehension and trying to string together an argument. The Chinese essay, it was called like the eight-legged essay or something like that. It was basically a test of how well you can synthesize the arguments of Confucianism and just spit them back at us. This was not an exercise in creativity. It was an exercise in submission. And that was, really underlying Confucianism and the whole logic of this thing. To understand the fundamental difference between Confucianism and Western thought, I think the best way to think about it is that in America, in the West more broadly, we think about intelligence and morality as distinct categories, right? It's the head and the heart. You can be a very dumb person who has a good heart. We all know guys like that. You can also be a very smart person who is evil. You think Lex Luthor, Elon Musk, Dr. Frankenstein. Being smart doesn't make you good. These are distinct categories. In Chinese culture, in the logic of Confucianism, there is no such thing as an evil genius. Because if you're smart, you can't be evil. Because being good, being virtuous, is defined by your intelligence. It is defined by how well you have internalized Confucianism as a system. As a result, what you end up with, the whole point I'm trying to make here, is that this all leads to a culture of very good test taking. It ends up with a culture of people who are down to do their homework. And that's what you're seeing with Asian students more broadly, is intense dedication towards taking in information and being able to spit it back out. You got to think about how we think about success, because that is part of the internal conflict of the Western education system, which is that we emphasize school, but on the other hand, we also emphasize the individual. So, in the Chinese system, going back within Confucianism, there are 4 types of jobs you can get as a guy. Women, obviously, back in those days, you were taking care of the family. But for the male breadwinner in a family, top job was scholar/statesman. This was what all the exams were for. You were trying to get into that top group. Below scholar was farmer, and below farmer was artisan. At the bottom was the merchant. Now, the scholar is the one who makes the rules, tells people what to do, how to organize society. The farmer grows food. The artisan makes things. So, they make sandals or something, or they sew clothing, or, they make fishing lines. At the bottom were the merchants. A merchant is somebody who buys things in one place and sells them in another place. In Confucian culture, these people are at the bottom of society because they're seen as parasites. They don't actually do anything. All you're doing is moving something from one place to another and skimming off the top. In Chinese culture back then, these were seen as the bottom of society. Whereas in the West, that's basically the best thing you can be, is somebody who is clever enough to do a little arbitrage play. That is the entrepreneur. Like I'm saying, in Chinese culture, there was only one way to get to the top, which was the imperial exam. In Western culture, going back forever, there has always been multiple paths towards success. This is liberalism. This is the individual. So you could do really good at school, or you could start your own business. You could be an entrepreneur. Or you could be, a priest or something. You could be a religious figure. You could be a military, war hero. These were all different paths to success. So as a result, even though we emphasize education and we tell kids to go to school, we also acknowledge that, hey, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, they dropped out of school and they became the top of society. So we have people in the Western culture who are venerated as heroes while also acknowledged as not being academically rigorous. In ancient China, pre-modern China, that didn't exist. That wouldn't work. It just wouldn't compute to people. And as a result, you end up with a culture of that emphasizes education. And that phrase is very curious to me because you hear it sometimes when people try to explain why Asian kids are good at school now compared to other minorities. And you hear people say, oh, their family puts an emphasis on education. That really downplays what's actually happening, or what did happen in pre-modern Asia, because it wasn't emphasis. That's the point I'm trying to make here. It was everything. Saying that Asian culture puts an emphasis on education is like saying hunter-gatherers put an emphasis on hunting and gathering. No, this was everything. This was not just about success. This was existential. You got to think these were, pre-modern times. This could be the difference between starvation and survival, between your lineage stopping and continuing. That was the battle that was being fought. And you got to think about this from the other side too, because when you foster a culture around subservience, around conformity, which is basically what Confucianism is. It is about conformity, conforming to the system as it exists. You end up with a culture that is based around that philosophy, which is that's why rock music never would have come out of China. If the British Empire had never opened up China, if Japan had never invaded China, and the Chinese system was able to keep building with its back against the West, as it did for, hundreds, thousands of years, they never would have come up with rock music on their own, because Confucianism quashes rebellion. Western culture celebrates rebellion. That's how you end up with modern pop music. That's how you end up with pop culture more broadly. That's how you end up with the kind of entrepreneurialism that provides the modern consumer internet. These things would not have grown out of a Confucian system, because It just wouldn't have occurred to anybody. And that's also why you can see now in the last 20 years as China has sort of reemerged as a dominant economic force. Its most salient features, the things that really drive its current success, is copying. It is rote memorization. It's looking at what the West does and its intellectual property. It's looking at, the way Apple designs a phone or a computer and reverse engineering it. It is about precision and about understanding a system, which is why they're able to build big cities in a matter of years. It's why they're able to take over world manufacturing. It is through the old system, because even though obviously China has modernized and they don't have the imperial system anymore, but underlying China, underlying Asian culture more broadly, is still the Confucian ethic of conformity and understanding a system, which is also why Chinese people tend to be Chinese culture tends to be very good at precision activities like ping pong or like billiards, throwing darts. These are systems that benefit from relentless practice and technical brilliance, not necessarily creativity or, reactivity as much as just drilling. And going into the future, if you're trying to predict where things are going to go, it is not a culture that we see in the West that is constantly fighting with itself, that is constantly one side tearing down another side. While that's happening in the West, what's happening in China, because Confucianism still underlies Asian culture, what you're seeing is a system that can maintain itself, because the entire point of the system was maintenance.